There is a very specific, heavy kinda silence that falls over a kitchen in the early hours of the morning. It is not an empty silence, it is a stillness that holds weight. It is the moment just before the world has truly decided to wake up. A suspended breath between the dreams of the night and the demands of the day. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the house's timber, and perhaps, if you are awake as I am, the sound of water beginning to heat up. It starts as a low murmur, a vibration in the kettle, before rising to a rolling boil. Then comes the pour, the steam rising in twisting gray ribbons, and finally that smell. That dark, roasted, earthy aroma that seems to reach into the very center of your chest and pull you upright. We are going to drift through that steam today. We are going to float backward against the rushing current of modern time to find the very first seed. We are not here to talk about the rush of caffeine or the anxiety of a deadline. We are here to talk about the slow, methodical, geological journey of the bean. Before we begin this long, quiet expedition into the ancient mists of the Ethiopian highlands, I have a small request for you. The world is a vast, sprawling place, and yet we are all connected by these invisible digital threads under the same sky. I want you to gently tap on your keyboard and leave a comment. Tell me exactly where you are watching us from. Look at your clock. What time is it there? Is it the deep, quiet middle of the night? Is it a lazy, rainy afternoon? Is the sun just coming up? Let me know. Let's see how many different time zones we can gather into this one, quiet, shared space. Now, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Pull the blankets up until you feel warm and secure. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let us begin. The story of coffee does not start with a porcelain cup. It does not start with a grinder or a bag of beans or the hiss of an espresso machine in a crowded city cafe. It begins with the earth itself. To understand the bean, we must first understand the ground that held it. We have to cast our minds back, not just hundreds of years, but thousands. We are traveling to the Horn of Africa, to a region where the geography is as dramatic and violent as the history it holds. This is the place where the Great Rift Valley slices through the continent, a massive geological tear where the earth is pulling itself apart. Because of this violence in the earth, the soil is rich. It is dark, volcanic soil, filled with minerals from the deep crust, soil that smells of iron and old rain. We are going to the Ethiopian plateau. Imagine the air here. It is not the hot, heavy air of the lowlands. We are high up, thousands of meters above sea level. The air is thin and crisp. It chills the skin in the morning and evening, providing a necessary respite from the equatorial sun that beats down during the day. It is a landscape of rugged green, of rolling hills that turn into jagged peaks, of mist that clings to the canopy of wild forests like a soft white blanket. This is a place where the distinction between myth and botany becomes beautifully blurred. In this region, specifically in a province that was once known as Kaffa, a name that whispers the etymological origin of the word coffee itself, the Coffea arabica plant grew wild. It was not a crop. It was not planted in neat rows. It was a part of the chaotic, beautiful undergrowth. It was a shrub, or perhaps a small tree, reaching upwards toward the dappled sunlight that filtered through the taller canopy of the forest. Its leaves were glossy and dark green, with a waxy texture that allowed the heavy rains of the highlands to slide right off. It is interesting to consider that for thousands of years, this plant existed in absolute silence. It was a secret kept by the forest. In the spring after the rains, the shrub would bloom. It produced small, delicate white flowers that looked like jasmine. They smelled like jasmine, too, sweet, heady, and perfume-heavy. These flowers were ephemeral. They lasted only a few days before the petals fell away to the forest floor, turning brown and dissolving back into the earth. In their place, small green berries began to form. Over the course of many months, under the slow passage of the sun and the moon, these berries would ripen. They would turn from a hard, pale green to a soft yellow, and finally to a vibrant, deep crimson. They looked like cherries. Inside these red fruits, encased in a sweet, sticky, mucilaginous pulp, were two seeds. They lay flat against each other, face to face, like two hands pressed together in eternal prayer. These seeds, which we now roast and grind and brew, were simply the pits of a fruit. The local fauna, the birds, the monkeys, the civets, would occasionally graze upon them, eating the sweet fruit and discarding the hard seeds. The silence of the forest was the only witness to this endless cycle of flowering, fruiting, and decaying. There was no trade, there was no economy, there was no addiction. There was simply the plant growing in the rich volcanic soil, fed by the decaying leaves of the forest floor and the reliable, thundering rains of the highlands. The indigenous people of this region, the ancestors of the Oromo people, were likely the first humans to interact with this plant. But they did not brew it. The concept of taking these hard seeds, roasting them over a fire, grinding them into dust, and steeping them in hot water was a technology that was centuries away. It was alien. Instead, they consumed the fruit. Perhaps they noticed that the birds who ate the red berries seemed more active, their songs lasting longer into the twilight. Or perhaps it was simply the result of human curiosity, the deep, ancestral need to forage and taste the world around them. The early usage was utilitarian. It was food for survival. The Oromo warriors and travelers would take the ripe berries, crush them, and mix them with animal fat. They would roll this mixture into dense, energy-rich spheres, about the size of a billiard ball. These were the original energy bars. They were portable, they did not spoil easily, and they were packed with calories. When a warrior was on a long march across the rugged terrain, or a traveler was crossing the high passes where the air was thin, they would eat one of these spheres. The caffeine was absorbed slowly, bound up in the fat and protein of the mixture. It did not provide the jittery spike of energy we know today. Instead, it provided a sustained, low-level endurance. It pushed back the horizon of exhaustion. It was a tool, grounded entirely in the physical necessities of life in a harsh, beautiful landscape. But history, as it often does, prefers a legend to a textbook. And coffee has one of the most enduring, charming legends of all. It is a story that has been told for over 1,000 years, passed down through oral tradition around campfires and in market squares until it was finally written down on parchment. It centers on a man named Kaldi. I want you to imagine Kaldi. He is a goat herder. He is a solitary figure, perhaps young, perhaps old, his skin weathered by the wind and the sun. He wears simple cloth made of woven cotton or wool. He walks with a wooden staff, polished smooth by years of handling. His days are defined not by a clock, but by the slow meandering of his goats. Goats are intelligent, curious, stubborn creatures. They are prone to wandering off the beaten path, climbing rocky outcrops, and nibbling on whatever greenery they can find. The legend says that one afternoon, Kaldi noticed something strange. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and burnt orange. Usually, at this time, his goats would become docile. They would huddle together for warmth, preparing to sleep, but today they were different. The herd was alive with a frantic, joyous energy. The goats were bleating loudly. They were jumping. They were prancing on their hind legs in a strange, chaotic dance, butting heads in play. They were not sleeping. They were wide awake, vibrating with life. Puzzled, and perhaps a bit concerned for the health of his flock, Kaldi investigated the area where they had been grazing. He found the shrubs with the glossy leaves. He saw the bright red berries. The goats had been stripping the branches of their fruit. Kaldi was a man of the earth. He knew his animals. He realized the berries were the cause. Curious, and perhaps needing to stay awake himself to watch over his hyperactive herd through the long night, Kaldi picked a few of the berries. He put one in his mouth. The taste was likely sweet, akin to a watermelon or a hibiscus flower, but with a slimy texture from the mucilage. He chewed the fruit and swallowed the seeds. Soon the effects took hold. The fatigue of the long day, the heaviness in his legs, the fog in his mind, it all evaporated. His heart beat a little faster. His vision seemed to sharpen. The world felt more vivid. The cool evening air felt invigorating rather than chilling. According to the lore, Kaldi did not just sit and watch. He joined his goats. Imagine that scene. A lone human figure dancing in the Ethiopian twilight, moving in rhythm with his animals under the sprawling canopy of the ancient trees, fueled by the very first dose of caffeine. The story moves from the hillside to the monastery. Kaldi, overwhelmed by this discovery, felt he had found something supernatural. He gathered a handful of these magic berries, wrapping them in a cloth, and brought them to a local monk in a nearby monastery. He explained the dancing goats. He explained the energy. He explained the lifting of fatigue. The monk was a man of tradition, conservative and wary. In the ancient world, anything that altered the mind or the spirit so abruptly was viewed with deep suspicion. He took the berries, looked at them, and declared them to be the devil's work. He called them a temptation, a distraction from the holy order of things. In a gesture of pious rejection, the monk threw the bright red berries into the fire that was burning in the hearth. And here, right here, this is the moment where biology meets chemistry. This is the moment the world changed. As the berries landed in the fire, the flesh burned away, but the seeds inside the beans began to roast. The moisture inside them evaporated into steam. The sugars began to caramelize, turning brown and complex. The proteins broke down. The oils began to release their volatile compounds. From the fire rose an aroma that had never existed on earth before. It was not the smell of burning fruit. It was the smell of roasted coffee. It was rich. It was nutty. It was smoky. It was chocolatey and earthy and utterly intoxicating. The scent drifted out of the hearth. It curled through the stone corridors of the monastery. It pulled other monks from their prayers and their cells. It was an aroma that commanded attention. It was irresistible. Realizing their mistake, or perhaps simply seduced by the smell, the monks raked the roasted beans from the embers. They were black and hot. To cool them down and preserve them, they threw the hot beans into a vessel of water. The water sizzled. The beans sank. And then, as they sat in the water, the essence of the beans seeped out. The water turned dark, the color of a moonless night. The monks tasted it. It was bitter, yes, it was strong, but it was also warming. Most importantly, the monks discovered that after drinking this dark liquor they could continue their prayers long into the night. The heaviness of sleep that usually plagued them during the midnight vigils, the nodding heads, the closing eyes, was gone. Their minds remained sharp. Their devotion was unwavering. The devil's fruit was immediately rebaptized. It was now seen as a gift from God, a tool sent to aid them in their religious observance. This transition from a forbidden substance to a holy aid is a theme we will see repeated throughout the history of coffee. It is a substance that straddles the line between vice and virtue, between the sacred and the profane. Whether this story of Kaldi is strict historical fact or merely folklore is immaterial. It captures the essence of coffee's discovery, the accidental realization of its power, the transformation through fire, and its immediate application in the pursuit of wakefulness. From the highlands of Ethiopia, the bean began its first great migration. It traveled north and east. It crossed the Red Sea. The distance is not far, geographically speaking. The Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, which translates to the Gate of Tears, separates the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. It is a narrow strip of water, but crossing it represented a massive cultural and botanical leap. The destination was Yemen. Here, in the rugged mountains of Yemen, the coffee trees found a second home. The conditions were strikingly similar to Ethiopia. There was high altitude. There were misty mornings. There were cool nights. But the soil composition was different, and this change in terroir began to alter the flavor profile of the bean, giving it a new complexity. It was here in Yemen that coffee cultivation truly began as a serious agricultural endeavor. It was no longer just gathered from the wild undergrowth. It was planted, it was tended, it was irrigated, it was harvested with intent. The port city of Mocha, or Al-Muka, became the center of this new world. For centuries, if you drank coffee anywhere in the world, it likely passed through the wooden docks of Mocha. The name itself became synonymous with the drink, a linguistic ghost that still haunts our chocolate coffee mixtures today. But in the 15th century, Mocha was more than a port. It was the gateway to the divine. The Sufi mystics of Yemen adopted coffee with a fervor that matched and perhaps exceeded the Ethiopian monks. Sufism is a mystical branch of Islam, and for the Sufis, worship was often an active, rhythmic, physical practice. It involved chanting, movement, and meditation that could last for hours, often stretching deep into the night. They needed stamina. They needed focus. They needed to ward off the biological imperative of sleep. They called the drink kahwa. Interestingly, this word had previously been used in Arabic to describe wine. Since alcohol is strictly forbidden in Islam, the name was transferred to this new, dark, stimulating beverage. It became the wine of Araby. But unlike wine, which dulls the senses, blurs the mind, and lowers inhibitions, kahwa sharpened the mind. It created a sober intoxication. It brought the drinker closer to God by allowing them to focus entirely on the divine presence, without the distraction of a tired body. Let us pause for a moment and visualize the process in these early Yemeni days. The methods were refining. It was becoming a ritual. The fruit was harvested by hand, cherry by cherry. Only when fully ripe, the flesh was stripped away to reveal the pale, green beans inside. These beans were then spread out on rooftops or stone patios to dry in the sun. This drying process was a labor of patience. The beans had to be raked constantly to ensure they dried evenly and to prevent fermentation or rot. The fierce sun of the Arabian Peninsula baked the moisture out of the seeds until they were hard as pebbles. Once dried, they could be stored, they could be transported. Then came the roasting. It was likely done in shallow metal pans or earthenware dishes over charcoal fires. The beans were turned by hand with a metal spoon. The sound of the roast, the first crack when the beans expand and pop like popcorn, and the second crack when the oils release, would have been the music of the kitchen. Then the grinding, a rhythmic pounding with a mortar and pestle, reducing the hard, roasted beans to a fragrant, coarse powder. And finally, the boiling. The powder was added to water, often with spices, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves. It was brought to a boil in a small long-handled pot called a dela. The mixture would foam up, rising to the rim, and the brewer would remove it from the heat, let it settle, and then return it to the flame. This was done 3 times. It was a dance with the heat. The resulting liquid was thick. It was dark. It was unfiltered. It was served in small cups, the ground settling at the bottom like a layer of silt or dark sand. To drink it was to consume the earth. It was a communal act. In the Sufi lodges, the cup was passed around, a shared vessel of wakefulness. It was a ritual that bound the community together, a circle of alertness in the dark of the night, a shield against the silence of the world outside. But coffee is a restless spirit. It could not be contained within the walls of the monastery or the Sufi lodge forever. It is the nature of such things to spill over, to leak out into the wider world. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, coffee began to move into the secular world. It flowed down from the mountains and into the streets of the great cities, Mecca, Medina, and Cairo. And this brings us to a crucial, pivotal development in the history of the world, the birth of the coffee house. Before this moment, socialization in the Islamic world, and indeed in much of the world, happened in specific regulated spheres. You socialized in the home, which was private. You socialized in the mosque, which was religious, or you socialized in the market, which was transactional. But the coffee house, the Cave Canes, offered something entirely new. It offered a third place. It was a place that was open to men of all classes. For the price of a cup of coffee, a meager sum, a scholar could sit next to a merchant. Poet could sit next to a laborer. A politician could sit next to a soldier. It was a place of conversation. In these dimly lit rooms, filled with the haze of tobacco smoke and the steam of coffee, the social hierarchies began to flatten. They played chess. They played backgammon. They listened to music. They listened to poetry recitals. But mostly they talked. They exchanged news. They started rumors. They debated politics. They criticized the government. The coffee house became known as the School of the Wise. It was a university for the common man, where the tuition was a penny and the curriculum was everything happening in the world. This seemingly innocent development terrified the authorities. A place where men gathered, stayed sober, and talked for hours. That was dangerous. That was a threat. Alcohol, for all its evils, dulls the mind. It slurs the speech. It makes rebellion sloppy and uncoordinated. A drunk man is rarely a successful revolutionary. Coffee, however, is different. Coffee sharpens the mind. It quickens the tongue. It encourages debate and clarity. In the year 1511, this tension came to a head. The governor of Mecca, a man named Beg, was walking through the city. He saw men drinking coffee in a mosque, preparing for a night of prayer. But he also knew of the coffeehouses. He knew that in those houses, men were criticizing his rule. They were mocking his decisions. He decided to act. He consulted with a group of conservative jurists and scholars. He argued that coffee was intoxicating, and therefore, under the laws of the Quran, it should be considered haram, forbidden, just like wine. He pushed the decree through. He ordered the coffee houses closed. He ordered the stocks of coffee seized and burned in the streets. For a brief moment, the silence returned. The smell of roasting coffee was replaced by the acrid smell of burning contraband. However, the ban did not last. It could not last. The Sultan in Cairo, a man who was technically the superior to the governor of Mecca, was a coffee drinker himself. When he heard of the ban, he was furious. He reprimanded Beg. He declared that coffee was not intoxicating in the way wine was, and therefore it was permissible. The decree was overturned. Beg was humiliated. The coffee flowed again. This pattern of banning coffee and then legalizing it would repeat itself. It happened in Mecca. It happened in Cairo. It happened in Istanbul. But the result was always the same. You cannot ban a habit that has become the rhythm of a culture. You cannot outlaw the morning. Coffee had become essential. It was no longer just a drink. It was the lubricant of social life. It was the fuel of commerce. It was the companion of the night. As we move deeper into the 16th century, the geopolitical map shifted. The Ottoman Turks, a rising power, conquered Yemen. They conquered Egypt. They inherited the coffee trade. And they took it to new heights of sophistication and control. Under the Ottomans, coffee became imperial. In the grand palaces of Istanbul, overlooking the Bosphorus Strait, coffee-making became a ceremonial art form. The Sultan employed a specific servant known as the chief coffee maker. This was not a lowly servant. This was a man of high status, with a retinue of dozens of assistants. He was responsible for the Sultan's cup. The beans had to be perfect. The roast had to be precise. The water had to be pure. The ceremony was elaborate. The coffee was served in cups made of gold or fine porcelain, often encrusted with gems. It was served with a glass of water to cleanse the palate and a piece of Turkish delight to balance the bitterness. It was said, and perhaps this is another legend, but it speaks to the truth of the time, that a woman in the Ottoman Empire had the legal right to divorce her husband if he failed to provide her with her daily quota of coffee. It was considered a basic human need, as vital as food or shelter. But the Ottomans were not just consumers. They were shrewd businessmen. They understood the value of what they held. They realized that they controlled the world's only supply of this magical bean. Yemen was the only place where it was grown commercially. The rest of the world, Europe, Asia, the Americas, had none. To protect this monopoly, the Ottomans imposed a strict, ruthless rule. No fertile beans were allowed to leave the empire. Before any sack of coffee was exported from the port of Mocha, the beans had to be treated. They were either parboiled in boiling water or roasted over a fire. This process killed the germ inside the seed. It meant that if a merchant from Venice or a pilgrim from India bought a sack of beans, they could grind them and brew them, but they could never plant them. They could put them in the soil, but nothing would grow. For nearly 100 years, the Ottomans held a botanical lock on the world's energy. It was a jealously guarded secret of nature that generated immense wealth for the empire. The coffee trade was a river of gold flowing into Istanbul. But nature, like history, abhors a vacuum. It resists containment. Secrets are hard to keep when they are as valuable as gold. All it would take to break this monopoly was one person with a pocket deep enough or a sash wide enough to hide a handful of raw, unroasted berries. The world was hungry for this black water. The demand was growing in the north and the east. The walls were about to be breached. We must now turn our gaze to a man named Baba Budan. Baba Budan was a Sufi saint from India. In the 17th century, he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. It was a long, arduous journey across the ocean and the desert. While he was in the holy cities, he tasted the coffee. He felt the clarity it brought to his prayers. He saw how it brought people together. He loved it. And he decided that his homeland, India, needed this gift. He knew the Ottoman rules. He knew that taking raw seeds was forbidden. He knew that if he were caught, the punishment would be severe, perhaps even death. But his desire to share this wonder outweighed the risk. Legend tells us that he found 7 raw, fertile coffee seeds. 7 is a sacred number in Islam. He took these 7 seeds and he strapped them to his stomach, hiding them beneath his robes against his skin. He walked through the checkpoints. He boarded a ship. He survived the long journey back across the Indian Ocean. He arrived in the hills of Chikmagalur in southern India. There, near his hermitage, he dug into the soil. He planted the 7 seeds. They grew. The monopoly was broken. From those 7 seeds, the vast coffee plantations of India would spring forth. The genetic code of the coffee plant had escaped the Middle East. It was loose in the world. While Baba Budan was planting his seeds in the quiet hills of India, the merchants of the West were becoming restless. Venetian traders who controlled much of the Mediterranean commerce had been interacting with the Ottomans for years. They had seen the Turks drinking this black liquid. They had smelled it. In 1615, they brought the first sacks of roasted coffee back to Venice. At first, Europe was confused. This drink was hot, black, and bitter. It was the complete opposite of the sweet wine and light beer that Europeans drank with every meal. Some priests in Italy were horrified. They called it the bitter invention of Satan. They argued that because it came from the Islamic world, the land of the infidels, it was spiritually dangerous for Christians to consume it. They urged Pope Clement VIII to ban it. But Pope Clement was a man of curiosity. He was not willing to ban something he had never tasted. He asked for a cup to be brought to him. He smelled the aroma. He took a sip, and then a smile spread across his face. He is famous for saying, "This devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." With the papal blessing, coffee was free to conquer Europe, and conquer it did. The first European coffee house opened in Venice in 1645, but the real explosion happened in London. The first coffee house in London opened in 1652, run by a Greek man named Pasqua Rosé. Within a few decades, there were over 3,000 coffee houses in London. They were called penny universities. For a penny, you could enter, buy a cup of coffee, and sit for hours listening to the smartest men in the city debate science, literature, and commerce. Lloyd's of London, now one of the world's largest insurance markets, started as a simple coffee house owned by Edward Lloyd. It was a place where sailors and ship owners gathered to drink coffee and discuss shipping news. The Royal Society, the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence, had its roots in the coffee-house discussions of Oxford. Isaac Newton discussed physics over coffee. The modern world, the world of stock markets, insurance, newspapers, and scientific debate, was forged in these rooms, fueled by this dark, bitter liquid from Ethiopia. But the Europeans had a problem. They were addicted to coffee, but they had to buy it from the Ottomans, and later the Arabs, who charged high prices. The Europeans were empire builders. They did not like being dependent on others. They wanted to own the means of production. They wanted to grow the coffee themselves. The race was on. It was a botanical arms race. The Dutch were the first to succeed on a grand scale. The Dutch East India Company, the most powerful corporation the world has ever seen, managed to smuggle some seedlings out of Yemen in 1616. They took them back to Holland. They tried to grow them in greenhouses in Amsterdam. But the climate was wrong. It was too cold, the sun was too weak, the plants survived, but they could not fuel an empire. So the Dutch looked to their colonies. They took the seedlings and shipped them to the other side of the world, to the island of Java, in what is now Indonesia. Java was perfect. It had the volcanic soil. It had the altitude. It had the rain. The plants thrived. By the end of the 17th century, the Dutch were the first European nation to have a commercial coffee estate. They flooded the market. Java became synonymous with coffee, a term we still use today. The Dutch became the masters of the trade, breaking the Arab monopoly completely. But the French wanted in. They were jealous of the Dutch success. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam, in a gesture of diplomatic goodwill, gave a gift to King Louis XIV of France. It was a single, healthy coffee plant, about 5 feet tall. The king was delighted. He treated it like a royal guest. He had it planted in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris, the Jardin des Plantes. He built a special heated greenhouse for it, a glass palace for a single tree. This single tree, guarded by the king's gardeners, is perhaps the most important tree in the history of the Americas. It would become the father, the patriarch, of billions of coffee trees. The story of how it crossed the Atlantic involves a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu. De Clieu was stationed in Martinique, a French colony in the Caribbean. He was convinced, absolutely convinced, that coffee would grow in the Caribbean. He traveled to Paris. He requested a clipping from the king's tree. He was refused. The tree was too valuable. The royal bureaucrat said no. But de Clieu was not a man to be deterred by paperwork. He was determined. One night, whether by bribing a gardener or scaling a wall, history is fuzzy on the exact method, he managed to obtain a small seedling. He potted it. He brought it aboard his ship. The journey back to Martinique was a nightmare. It was an odyssey. The ship was attacked by Tunisian pirates. De Cleo had to fight them off, sword in hand, protecting the ship and his precious plant. Then a violent storm struck, nearly capsizing the vessel. The glass case protecting the plant was smashed. De Cleo had to build a new one from wood and plastic to keep the salt spray off the leaves. But the greatest threat was the calm. The ship became becalmed in the middle of the Atlantic. The wind died. They drifted for weeks under the relentless, baking sun. Water supplies ran critically low. Rationing was imposed. Men were dying of thirst. De Cleo, desperate to keep his cargo alive, made a sacrifice. He shared his meager ration of water with the plant. Every day, with his own lips cracked and bleeding, his throat parched, he would pour half of his cup of water into the soil of the seedling. He prioritized the future of agriculture over his own comfort. He arrived in Martinique with the plant still alive. It was weak, but alive. He planted it in his garden. He surrounded it with a hedge of thorns to keep out animals and thieves. He watched over it day and night. It grew. It recovered. It thrived in the Caribbean soil. It bore fruit. De Cleo gave seeds to his friends. They planted them. Within 50 years, there were 18 million coffee trees on the island of Martinique alone. From Martinique, the seeds traveled to Haiti, to Mexico, and to the rest of the Caribbean. But the giant was still sleeping in the south. Brazil. The arrival of coffee in Brazil, which is now the world's largest producer, is another tale of romance and intrigue. In 1727, there was a border dispute between French Guiana and Dutch Guiana. They asked Brazil to mediate. The Brazilian government sent a charming army officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta to settle the dispute. But his secret mission was to get coffee seeds. The French governor of Guiana, guarding his crop, refused to give him any. But Palheta was a man of great charm. He seduced the governor's wife. On the day of his departure, after the dispute was settled, the governor's wife presented him with a farewell gift. It was a large, beautiful bouquet of flowers. Buried deep inside the flowers, hidden among the blooms, were viable coffee seeds. Palheta took them back to Brazil. He planted them in the state of Pará. They found the red, iron-rich soil of Brazil to be the most hospitable place on earth. The climate was perfect. The land was endless. Brazil would go on to become the undisputed king of coffee, transforming the global economy. As the coffee plantations expanded across the New World, the nature of the drink began to change. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was no longer just a drink for the elite scholars or the mystics. It was becoming the fuel of the working man. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to stir in the North. The world was shifting. We were moving from the sun-based cycle of the farm, where you worked when it was light and slept when it was dark, to the clock-based cycle of the factory. People needed to wake up at unnatural times. They needed to work for 12, 14, 16 hours straight. They needed to operate dangerous, heavy machinery without losing focus. Beer and wine, which had been the safe beverages of the Middle Ages, because the water was often dirty, were dangerous in a factory. A drunk worker gets his hand caught in the loom. Coffee was the answer. It provided the energy to work. It provided the focus. It provided the warmth to survive in cold, unheated factories. It became the drink of the proletariat. It was the black blood of the industrial age. But we must also pause here. We must acknowledge the darker, heavier side of this history. We cannot tell the story of the bean without telling the story of the hands that picked it. The sweetness in the cup of the European aristocracy was paid for with the bitterness of forced labor. The vast plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil were powered by the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of people were stolen from Africa, the very continent where coffee was born, and shipped across the ocean to tend the trees of their homeland for the profit of others. It is a tragic, heavy irony. The bean of liberation, the bean that fueled the Enlightenment and the discussions of liberty in the coffeehouses of Paris, was harvested by those in chains. This is the sediment at the bottom of the cup. This is the history we must remember as we drink. By the time we reach the 20th century, coffee had conquered the world. It was everywhere. It was in the trenches of the First World War, where soldiers were issued coffee rations to keep them alert in the face of death. In the United States, it had become a patriotic duty to drink coffee after the Boston Tea Party, a rejection of British tea. But the 20th century brought the era of speed, the era of convenience. In 1901, a Japanese-American chemist named Satoru Kato invented soluble coffee, instant coffee. It was quick, it was easy, it didn't require a pot or a grinder. During World War II, the U.S. military bought huge quantities of instant coffee for the troops. It wasn't the best tasting. It was often harsh and metallic, but it was hot, and it had caffeine. After the war, the focus of the coffee industry shifted to quantity and consistency. The first wave of commercial coffee was about getting a can of pre-ground coffee into every kitchen in America. Brands like Folgers and Maxwell House became household names. It was a commodity. It was a staple. It was something you bought in a tin and boiled in a percolator until it was black and bitter. Flavor was secondary to the ritual and the drug. But as the century wore on, a rebellion began to brew. People started to remember. They remembered that coffee was a fruit. They remembered that it had complexity. They remembered that it came from specific places with specific soils. This was the birth of the second wave. Peet's Coffee, Starbucks. In the 1960s and 70s, they began roasting darker. They began talking about the origin of the beans. Suddenly, you weren't just drinking coffee, you were drinking a Sumatra. You were drinking a Colombian. We learned a new language: latte, cappuccino, macchiato. The espresso machine, invented in Italy at the turn of the century to speed up the brewing process for workers rushing to catch trains, became the altar of the modern café. And now we find ourselves in the third wave, an era of obsession. We have returned to the beginning. We treat coffee like wine. We care about the altitude. We care about the processing method: washed, natural, honey. We know the name of the farmer. We weigh our beans to the gram. We pour water with the precision of a chemist. We are chasing the perfect extraction, trying to unlock the ghost of the flavor that Kaldi first tasted on that hillside in Ethiopia. The circle is complete. We have gone from the wild forest to the global commodity and back to the reverence for the seed. As the steam clears from our kitchen and the cup sits empty on the saucer, we are left with the silence of the room once more. The journey is done. The caffeine has done its work in history, sparking revolutions, fueling industries, and opening eyes. But now, for us, in this quiet space, it is time to close them. The world continues to spin. The coffee trees continue to grow in the high mountains, the berries turning from green to red in the quiet of the forest, waiting for the next sunrise. But you do not need to wait. The history is written. The script is finished. The pot is empty. The steam has settled now. The air in the room is still, holding that faint, lingering ghost of the roasted bean we spoke of earlier. If you are still with me, if your eyes are still open, or perhaps just resting heavily behind closed lids, we are going to remain in this quiet space. We are not done. We have traced the line from the Ethiopian forest to the global cup, but that was merely the map. Now we must walk the territory. We must look at the dust in the cracks of the floorboards of history. We must look at the specific, slow moments that truly defined this dark liquid. Before we sink back into the chair, before we let the weight of the day fully slide off our shoulders, I want to know about the atmosphere in your room right now. In the comments, tell me about the weather outside your window. Is it raining? Is there a heavy fog pressing against the glass? Is it a clear, silent night with the moon hanging low? Or is the sun casting long, lazy afternoon shadows across your floor? Describe the light or the lack of it. Let us build a weather map of our shared relaxation. Now, take a deep breath. Hold it for a moment, feeling the expansion in your chest, and then let it out slowly, like steam escaping a valve. Let us return to the past. We left off talking about the spread of coffee, but we must pause and linger in the 17th century. We need to sit down in London. We need to understand the texture of the penny university. In the year 1652, London was a city of ale. It was a city of fog and mud, a city where the water was unsafe to drink, so men drank beer from morning until night. The city was in a perpetual, low-level haze of intoxication. The streets were loud, the business was sloppy, and the mind was dulled. Then the coffee house arrived. I want you to imagine walking into one of these establishments, perhaps Pasqua Rosé's Head near St. Michael's Alley. You step off the cobblestones, slick with rain, and push open a heavy wooden door. The first thing that hits you is not the smell of stale beer, but the smell of smoke. Tobacco smoke. Long clay pipes are being smoked by almost every man in the room. The air is blue and thick. Beneath the smoke is the smell of the coffee, dark, boiled, charcoal-like. The room is dim, lit by tallow candles that flicker and drip wax onto the oak tables. There is no music. There are no barmaids. There is only the low, steady hum of male voices. Hundreds of men. They are sitting on wooden benches, huddled over long tables, scattered with pamphlets and newsletters. You pay 1 penny at the door. That is the admission fee. For that penny, you get a bowl, not a cup, but a bowl of coffee, and you get the right to sit, you get the right to listen. There is a specific rhythm to these places. Runners, young boys with ink-stained fingers, dash in and out of the door, carrying fresh sheets of paper, the newsletters. They jump onto a table and read the headlines aloud. A ship has arrived from the East Indies. The king has fallen ill. The price of wool has dropped. The room falls silent to listen, and then erupts into debate. This was the internet of the 1600s. It was slow, it was physical, it was smoky, but it was the hive mind of the city waking up from a centuries-long drunk. Let us drift from the wooden benches of London to a different kind of silence. Let us travel east, across the continent, to the gates of Vienna. The year is 1683. The city is under siege. The Ottoman army, vast and powerful, has surrounded the city walls. They have been there for months. Inside, the Viennese are starving. Outside, the Turks are brewing coffee. The smell of the roasting beans drifts over the defensive walls, taunting the hungry Austrians. The siege is eventually broken. The Polish cavalry arrives, the winged hussars, thundering down the hills to drive the Ottomans away. In their hasty retreat, the Turkish army leaves behind their tents, their weapons, and hundreds of sacks of strange, green-gray beans. The Viennese soldiers think it is camel feed. They want to burn it or throw it into the Danube. But one man, a soldier and spy named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, knows better. He has lived among the Turks. He knows what the beans are. He claims the sacks as his reward for service. He opens the first coffee house in Vienna, the Blue Bottle. But here is where the story shifts. The Viennese did not like the gritty, black, bitter sludge that the Turks drank. It was too harsh for their palate. So, Kulczycki did something revolutionary. He filtered the coffee to remove the grounds, and then he added a spoonful of honey, and finally a splash of milk. The liquid turned from black to a soft, creamy nut brown. This was the birth of the melange, the ancestor of the cappuccino. The Viennese coffee house developed a completely different soul from the London ones. If London was a stock market, Vienna was a living room. Imagine the Café Central or the Café Spurl. The floors are not wood, but polished marble. The ceilings are high and vaulted, echoing the silence. The chairs are made of bentwood, the famous Thonet chairs, light and elegant. The waiters wear tuxedos. They do not rush. In Vienna, you do not buy coffee to wake up. You buy coffee to buy time. There is a saying. The Viennese coffee house is a place where time and space are consumed, but only the coffee is found on the bill. You could order a single cup and sit for 5 hours. You could read the newspaper, which was mounted on a bamboo stick to keep the pages smooth. You could write a novel. You could stare out the window at the snow falling on the Ringstrasse. It was a place of solitude in the company of others, a place to be alone without being lonely. Let us leave the cities now. Let us leave the smoke of London and the marble of Vienna. Let us go back to the plant itself. We skimmed over the botany in our first journey, but to truly understand the sleepiness of this history, we must understand the slow, biological struggle of the tree. The coffee tree, Coffea arabica, is a creature of habit. It hates change. It likes a temperature that stays between 18 and 21 degrees Celsius. It likes rain, but not too much. It likes sun, but not direct scorching heat. It is a picky, delicate organism. I want you to visualize the root system. Beneath the rich volcanic soil, the coffee tree sends down a taproot. This is a thick central anchor that drives straight down into the dark earth. It can go down 2, 3, sometimes 4 meters, searching for water tables deep in the ground. Radiating out from this taproot are the feeder roots. These form a mat just below the surface, drinking in the rain and the nutrients from the decomposing leaves. It is a silent, subterranean network, anchoring the tree against the winds of the high altitudes. And the altitude matters. This is the secret of the flavor. The best coffee grows high up, often above 1,500 meters. Up there, the air is thin, the nights are cold, the tree is stressed, it has to fight to survive. Because of this struggle, the ripening process slows down. The cherry does not ripen in a month, it takes 6, 8, sometimes 9 months. This slowness is crucial. It allows the sugars to develop. It allows the complex acids, the citric, the malic, the phosphoric, to form within the dense cellular structure of the bean. A coffee bean grown in the lowlands, where it is hot and easy, is soft and flavorless. A coffee bean grown in the highlands, where it is cold and difficult, is hard, dense, and full of flavor. The taste of your coffee is literally the taste of the plant's suffering, resolved into sugar. Let's peel the fruit. Imagine holding a single ripe coffee cherry in your hand. It is cool and smooth. If you were to dissect it, layer by layer, you would find a fascinating anatomy. First, the outer skin, the exocarp. It is thick and bitter. Peel that away, and you find the mesocarp, the pulp. This is the sweet, sticky layer, like a grape. Beneath that is the pectin layer, the mucilage. It is slippery, like a gel. Then comes the endocarp, or the parchment. This is a tough, hole-like shell that protects the seed. It feels like paper. Break that open, and there is one final layer, the silver skin. It is a membrane so thin, so delicate, it is almost transparent. And finally, beneath all those layers of armor, lies the blue-green seed, the bean. It is sleeping. It is waiting for the fire. The movement from the farm to the cup was, for centuries, a local affair. You bought green beans. You roasted them in a pan in your kitchen. It was smoky, inconsistent, and laborious. But the 19th century brought the machine. It brought the Industrial Revolution to the breakfast table. We must speak of the roar of the roaster. In the 1860s, a man named Jabez Burns invented the self-emptying coffee roaster. Before this, you had to stop the machine and scrape the hot beans out. Burns invented a cylinder with a spiral flange inside. When the roast was done, you simply opened a gate, and the spinning cylinder pushed the beans out into the cooling tray. It turned roasting from an art into a process. And then came the bag. This sounds mundane, I know, a bag. But in the history of boring things, the paper bag is a titan. Before the 1860s, if you bought coffee at a store, the grocer scooped it out of a barrel. It was exposed to air. It was stale. It tasted like the wood of the barrel and the pickle barrel next to it. Enter the Arbuckle brothers in Pittsburgh. They patented a process to coat the roasted beans in a mixture of egg and sugar. This glaze sealed the bean, keeping the oxygen out and the aroma in. But more importantly, they started selling coffee in 1-pound paper packages. Arbuckle's Ariosa Coffee. It was the first brand. You didn't just buy coffee anymore, you bought Arbuckles. Inside the bag, they included a stick of peppermint candy as a prize. Later, they included coupons. You could save up your coffee coupons and buy a pair of scissors, a handkerchief, or even a wedding ring. Coffee became the currency of the American household. This industrialization changed the sound of the morning. It was no longer the sound of a mortar and pestle pounding the beans. It was the sound of the grinder in the grocery store, a large, red, cast-iron wheel, and then later, the sound of the percolator, the percolator. Let us meditate on that sound for a moment. Bloop, bloop, hiss. The water boiling in the bottom chamber forced up a narrow metal tube, splashing over the grounds in the basket, and dripping back down to be boiled again. It was a violent way to brew coffee. It boiled the flavor out, leaving a dark, bitter liquid. But it was hot, it was strong, and it was infinite. This gave rise to the American diner, the chrome counters, the vinyl stools, the heavy ceramic mugs, thick-walled to keep the heat in, cream-colored with a brown rim, and the waitress with the glass pot walking the line, asking the eternal question, Top it off, hun. The bottomless cup. In the diner, coffee ceased to be a beverage and became a rental agreement. As long as you had coffee in your cup, you owned the booth. You could sit there at 3 a.m. under the buzzing fluorescent lights, watching the rain streak the window, holding the warm mug with both hands. It was the democratization of the coffee house. You didn't need a penny or a tuxedo, you just needed a quarter. But as the 20th century rolled on, the machines got smaller. They moved from the factory to the kitchen counter. In 1972, a new sound entered the home, the gurgle and drip of the Mr. Coffee. Vincent Marotta, the inventor, saw that people were tired of the percolator. He wanted something that worked like the machines in the restaurants. He hired Joe DiMaggio, the baseball legend, to be the spokesman. Suddenly, everyone had a plastic machine on their counter. You put a paper filter in a plastic basket. You scooped in the Folgers. You poured in the water. You flipped a switch. The water heated up. It dripped through the grounds. It collected in a glass carafe sitting on a hot plate. The smell filled the suburban kitchen. It was the smell of consistency. Every morning, the same cup. The ritual became automated. The silence of the morning was broken by the gurgle of the final drops, the signal that the day had officially begun. We have moved through the smoke of London, the marble of Vienna, the soil of the high mountains, and the chrome of the diner. We have seen the bean stripped of its fruit, roasted in iron, glazed in sugar, and sealed in paper. We have seen it boil and drip. But there is so much more. We have not yet spoken of the espresso machine, the steam engine of the bar counter. We have not spoken of the war between the Robusta and the Arabica. We have not spoken of the decaffeination process, the chemical stripping of the soul of the bean for those who want the taste without the wakefulness. The history of coffee is a fractal. The closer you look, the more details emerge. Every cup is a history lesson, every sip a communion with the trade routes of the past. The room is quiet again. The imaginary diner has faded. The Vienna Cafe has closed its doors for the night. You are back in your bed or your chair. The screen is dim. The story is pausing, hovering like a grand pause in a symphony, waiting for the baton to lift again. We will rest here for now. We will let the sediment settle to the bottom of the pot. There are more chapters to brew, more grounds to grind, but they can wait. The harvest is done for the day. The silence in the room has deepened now. The world outside has retreated even further, leaving us wrapped in a cocoon of quietude. If you listen very carefully, you might hear the settling of the house, the faint tick of a cooling heater, or perhaps just the rhythmic sound of your own breathing. We are still drifting through the history of the bean, floating on the steam of centuries past. We have traveled a great distance already, from the ancient forests of Kaffa to the neon-lit diners of America, but the journey is far from over. There are still many cups to pour, many grounds to examine. Before we press the button to continue, before we engage the next gear of this slow machine, I want you to look around your immediate vicinity. Is there a mug nearby? Perhaps on a coaster, perhaps sitting in the sink, waiting to be washed. In the comments, I want you to describe your favorite coffee mug to me. Not the one you use because it is clean, but the one you reach for first. Is it heavy ceramic? Is it chipped at the rim? Does it have a faded slogan or a picture of a cat? Does it fit perfectly in the cup of your hands? Tell me about the vessel that holds your morning ritual. Now, let your hands relax. Let your fingers go loose. Let us return to the story. We ended our last session with the gurgle of the home brewer, the sound of gravity pulling water through grounds. But to understand the true pulse of the 20th century, we must leave the American kitchen and return to Europe. We must go to Italy. We must talk about pressure. For hundreds of years, making coffee was a passive act. You boiled water, you mixed it with coffee, and you waited. You waited for the grounds to settle, Turkish style. You waited for gravity to pull the water through a cloth or paper filter, drip style. But the world was speeding up. The Industrial Revolution had given way to the age of the steam engine and the factory whistle. People did not have time to sit for 40 minutes in a Viennese cafe waiting for the grounds to sink. The workers in Milan and Turin needed energy, and they needed it subito, instantly. This need for speed gave birth to a machine that looked more like a locomotive than a kitchen appliance. In 1884, a man named Angelo Moriondo presented a bronze behemoth at the Turin General Exposition. It used steam pressure to force water through a large puck of coffee. It was huge. It brewed pots, not cups. It was a boiler on a counter. But the true revolution came in 1901 with Luigi Bezzera. He refined the idea. He made it smaller. He figured out how to brew a single cup. He invented the portafilter, that heavy, handled brass basket that the barista locks into the group head with a satisfying clunk. I want you to visualize the mechanics of these early machines. They were vertical cylinders, shining in chrome and brass, topped with an eagle or a statuette. Inside, water was heated to a boil. The barista would open a valve, and steam would scream through the coffee. It was violent. It was hot. The coffee that came out was burnt, bitter, and thin. It was called espresso because it was made expressly for the customer, on demand. But the steam was the problem. It was too hot. It cooked the coffee. The search for the perfect extraction continued until 1948. When a man named Achille Gaggia changed the physics of the bar counter. Gaggia didn't use steam pressure to push the water. He used a spring. Imagine the barista pulling down a long, heavy lever. This action compressed a powerful spring inside the piston. When the lever was released, the spring expanded, pushing a piston down. This forced hot water, but not boiling water, through the coffee at high pressure, specifically at 8 to 10 atmospheres of pressure. This pressure did something magical. It didn't just wash the solids off the bean, it emulsified the oils. It squeezed the very soul out of the grind. And when the liquid flowed into the tiny white cup, it was topped with a layer of reddish-brown foam. Gaggia called it crema. The customers were suspicious. They asked, "What is this scum on my coffee?" Gaggia, a master of marketing, told them it was cream coffee natural. It was the hallmark of quality. It trapped the aroma inside the cup. This invention changed the posture of coffee drinking. In London, you sat on a bench. In Vienna, you sat in a bentwood chair. In Italy, you stood. You stood at the banco, the marble bar. You paid first at the register, holding your receipt. You slapped the receipt on the counter. The barista, moving with the grace of a dancer, ground the beans, tamped them, locked the portafilter, and pulled the shot. Click, hiss, drip. You drank it in 2 or 3 sips. It was a shot of adrenaline. It was a social interaction that lasted 3 minutes. It was the rhythm of the city, the clatter of the saucer on the marble, the hiss of the steam wand frothing milk for a cappuccino, but only before 11 a.m., never after, the murmur of grazie. This was the mechanical heart of the coffee world, pumping caffeine into the veins of Europe. But while the Italians were perfecting the art of the expensive, complex machine, another war was being fought in the botany of the bean. We must go back to the forest, but not to Ethiopia. We are going to the Congo. For most of history we drank Coffea arabica. It is the noble bean. It is complex, acidic, sweet, and difficult to grow. It gets sick easily. It needs height. But in the late 19th century, explorers discovered a cousin in the lowlands of the Congo. Its scientific name is Coffea canephora, but the trade gave it a name that describes its character, Robusta. I want you to imagine the Robusta tree. It is not delicate. It is a tank. It grows in the heat. It grows at sea level. It resists pests. If a bug tries to eat the leaf of a Robusta tree, it dies because the caffeine content is nearly double that of Arabica. Caffeine is nature's pesticide, but this strength comes with a price. Robusta does not taste like flowers or fruit or chocolate. It tastes like wood. It tastes like burnt rubber. It tastes like grain and earth. It is harsh. It hits the back of the tongue with a heavy, lingering bitterness. However, the industry loved it. Why? Because it was cheap, it was easy to grow, you couldn't kill it, and it produced a thick, heavy crema on an espresso. So, the coffee merchants began to blend it. They would take a bag of expensive Arabica and cut it with 30% or 40% Robusta. It lowered the cost. It increased the caffeine kick. It made the coffee stronger in the brute force sense of the word. This ushered in an era of commodity coffee where the goal was not flavor, but impact. The bitterness became the expected taste. People forgot the tea-like delicacy of the Ethiopian bean and came to associate coffee flavor with the punch of Robusta. It was the industrial workhorse, the coal that fueled the furnace of the workforce. And speaking of industrial workhorses, we must turn our gaze to the chemistry set. We must talk about the powder. The dream of instant coffee is old. Soldiers in the American Civil War were issued a coffee essence, a thick black goop in a tin that tasted mostly of grease and regret. But the technology to turn a brewed cup of coffee into a dry powder that could be rehydrated later was perfected by a Japanese-American chemist named Satoru Kado in 1901, and marketed by a man named George Washington, not the president but an inventor living in Guatemala. But it was war that solidified the powder. In the trenches of World War I, and later in the freezing foxholes of World War II, soldiers did not have espresso machines. They did not have percolators. They had a tin cup and a packet of G. Washington's coffee. It was easy, just add hot water. The chemistry of this is fascinatingly violent. To make instant coffee, you first brew huge vats of very strong, thick coffee concentrate. Then, you have two choices. The first is spray drying. Imagine a massive, hot metal tower, several stories high. You spray the liquid coffee into the top of the tower in a fine mist. As the mist falls through the hot, dry air inside the tower, the water evaporates instantly. By the time the droplet hits the bottom, it has turned into a dry, dusty powder. It is efficient, but the heat kills the flavor. It cooks the volatile oils away, leaving only the burnt caramel backbone. The second method is freeze-drying. This is gentler. You take the coffee concentrate and freeze it into a slab of dark ice. Then you grind the ice into granules. You put these frozen granules into a vacuum chamber. In a vacuum, ice does not melt into water, it sublimates. It turns directly from solid to gas. The water vanishes, leaving behind the skeletal structure of the coffee crystal. This preserves more flavor, but it is expensive. Instant coffee changed the domestic landscape. It divorced the drink from the bean entirely. There were no grounds to throw away. There was no machine to clean. There was just a jar of brown crystals in a kettle. In the 1950s and 60s, this was the height of modernity. It was space-age food. It was the era of the TV dinner and the instant pudding. We sacrificed the ritual for the convenience, trading the aroma of the roast for the speed of the spoon. But what if you wanted the taste, but not the wakefulness? What if you loved the smoke and the warmth, but you wanted to sleep? We must look at the strange history of decaffeination. It began, like many things in chemistry, with an accident. In 1903, a German merchant named Ludwig Roselius received a shipment of coffee beans. During the voyage, the ship had been swamped by a storm. The cargo hold was flooded with seawater. The beans were soaked. Roselius, not wanting to lose his investment, rinsed them and roasted them anyway. He tasted the coffee. It tasted fine. A bit salty, perhaps, but drinkable. But he noticed something. He drank cup after cup, but he did not feel the buzz. The seawater had leached out the caffeine. Roselius saw an opportunity. He patented a process to remove caffeine industrially. But he couldn't use seawater. He needed a solvent. He chose benzene. Benzene is an effective solvent. It is also, we now know, a potent carcinogen. It is found in gasoline. But in the early 20th century, it was the secret ingredient in Sanka, from the French sans caffeine. For decades, decaf coffee was a chemical bath. Beans were steamed to open their pores, then rinsed over and over with solvents, methylene chloride or ethyl acetate, to dissolve the caffeine molecule. The caffeine was then siphoned off and sold to soda companies, because that caffeine in your cola has to come from somewhere, and the flavorless, solvent-washed beans were roasted dark to hide the chemical taste. It wasn't until much later that we developed the Swiss water process, a method using osmosis and charcoal filters, a slow, gentle way to coax the caffeine out without chemicals. But for a long time, the orange handle of the decaf pot represented a compromise. It was a phantom limb of a drink, the memory of coffee without the spirit. So now let us survey the landscape we have built. We have the espresso machine hissing in Italy, pressing oils into a golden crema. We have the Robusta trees growing thick and strong in the jungles, adding weight and bitterness to the blend. We have the spray-drying towers turning liquid into dust for the sake of convenience. And we have the chemical plants stripping the energy away from the bean. The mid-20th century was an era of industrial dominance. Coffee had become a fuel. It was a commodity traded on the futures market in New York. Right next to oil and steel, it was standardized. A can of coffee bought in Seattle tasted exactly the same as a can bought in Miami. It was reliable, it was consistent, and, truth be told, it was often stale. The silence of the forest where Kaldi danced had been replaced by the roar of the factory. The mystery of the Sufi ritual had been replaced by the efficiency of the break room. The coffee was hot, it was brown, and it was everywhere. But in the background, something was stirring, a dissatisfaction, a memory. There were people who remembered that coffee was a fruit. There were people who remembered the smell of the fresh roast. There were small shops in Berkeley and Seattle where men with beards were buying old cast-iron roasters and asking questions about where the beans came from. They were looking at the dark, oily beans of the industrial roast and wondering if there was something more. They were wondering if the flavor of the mountain, the flavor of the rain and the soil, could be found again. The giant was sleeping, comfortable in its dominance of instant jars and diner mugs. But the rebellion was brewing. The second wave was about to crash onto the shore, bringing with it the language of the sommelier and the price tag of a luxury good. But that is a story of awakening. And right now, we are concerned with rest. Let us sit for a moment in this industrial era. Imagine the hum of a neon sign outside a diner window. Imagine the steam rising from a styrofoam cup. Imagine the smell of a freshly opened can of vacuum-packed grounds, that sharp, intense burst of aroma that fades so quickly. The machinery of coffee is vast. It involves millions of hands, millions of tons of steel, and billions of gallons of water. It never stops. Even now, as you lay there, ships are crossing the ocean, carrying shipping containers filled with burlap sacks. Roasters are spinning. Grinders are burring. But in your room, the machinery is off. The cup is put away. The noise of the world is muffled by the distance of history. We are hovering here between the era of the commodity and the era of the artisan. It is a good place to rest, a quiet place. We will leave the beans in the silo for now. We will leave the espresso machine cooling down, the pressure gauge dropping slowly back to zero. The story continues, as it always does, but we can pause the tape. We can let the silence return. The silence of the room is now a heavy, comfortable blanket. The world outside has ceased to matter. There is only the low hum of this narrative, a steady frequency designed to hold you in the space between waking and sleeping. We have traveled through time, through geography, through the mechanics of steam and the chemistry of solvents. We have seen the bean as a mystic tool, a colonial prize, an industrial fuel, and a household staple. But we are not done. The story of coffee is deep, deeper than the taproot of the oldest tree in Ethiopia. We must go further. We must examine the shift, the turning of the tide, the moment when the world remembered that coffee was not just a brown powder, but a seed with a soul. I want you to visualize a color, not the black of the liquid nor the brown of the roasted bean. I want you to visualize green, the deep, waxy green of the leaf and the pale jade green of the unroasted seed. This is where the potential lies. This is the sleeping state of flavor. In the mid-20th century, the coffee world was flat. It was a landscape of consistency. Whether you were in a boardroom in New York or a kitchen in London, the coffee tasted largely the same: roasted, bitter, hot. It was a delivery system for caffeine. The bean was treated like coal, a raw material to be burned for energy. The origin didn't matter, the altitude didn't matter, the farmer didn't matter. All that mattered was the price per pound and the tin it came in. But in the quiet corners of the world, a rebellion was beginning. It didn't start with a shout, it started with a smell. Let us travel to Berkeley, California. The year is 1966. The air is filled with the scent of change. Political change, social change, musical change. But on a small street called Vine Street, there is a different scent. It is the smell of dark roasted coffee. This is the shop of Alfred Peet. Alfred Peet was a Dutchman. His father roasted coffee in Holland. Pete grew up with the smell of the roast in his clothes. When he came to America, he was appalled. He drank the diner coffee, the weak, amber-colored water that Americans called coffee, and he called it dishwater. He knew what coffee could be. He remembered the rich, oily, intense flavors of the Indonesian beans his father used to roast. So, he opened Pete's Coffee and Tea. He bought his own roaster. He imported his own beans directly from high-quality sources, and he roasted them dark, darker than anyone else in America. He roasted them until the oils came to the surface, until the beans glistened like black pearls. He brewed it strong. When people walked into his shop, they were confused. The coffee was intense. It was smoky. It had body. It coated the tongue. It was a shock to the system. But it was also a revelation. People tasted it and realized what they had been missing. They realized that coffee had flavor. A cult following began to form. These were the Peetniks, the early adopters of the second wave. Among the people who learned from Alfred Peet were three men: Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker. They were from Seattle. They loved Peet's coffee. They wanted to bring that style of roasting to their rainy, gray city in the Pacific Northwest. Alfred Peet taught them how to roast. He even supplied them with their first bags of green beans. In 1971, they opened a small shop in Seattle's Pike Place Market. They named it after the first mate in Herman Melville's novel, Moby Dick. A man who was practical, steady, and loved coffee. They named it Starbucks. At first, Starbucks did not sell drinks. You could not order a latte. You could not order a frappuccino. It was a store that sold whole beans, tea, and spices. You went there to buy your beans to take home. It was a place for purists. The logo was a twin-tailed siren, a woodcut image that looked ancient and mysterious, calling sailors to the rocks. But the true transformation of Starbucks and the transformation of the world's coffee culture came with a man named Howard Schultz. He joined the company in the early 80s. In 1983, he took a trip to Milan, Italy. I want you to walk with Howard Schultz through the streets of Milan. It is morning. The air is cool. The streets are bustling with fashionable people in coats and scarves. Schultz walks past the open doors of the espresso bars. He hears the hiss of the steam wands. He hears the clatter of the saucers. He sees the baristas greeting customers by name. He sees the community. He sees the theater of it all. He realizes that in America, coffee is a product. But in Italy, coffee is an experience. It is a social glue. It is a third place. Not home, not work, but somewhere in between where you can feel a sense of belonging. He rushed back to Seattle. He told the founders, "We have to sell drinks. We have to make espresso. We have to steam milk." The founders were skeptical. They were roasters, not restaurant owners. They didn't want the hassle of selling cups of coffee. But eventually, Schultz prevailed by buying the company, and the modern coffee shop was born. This was the explosion. This was the second wave. Suddenly, we had a new vocabulary. We learned the difference between a latte, lots of milk, little foam, and a cappuccino, lots of foam, less milk. We learned what a macchiato was, marked with a stain of milk. We learned to say venti and grande. The coffee shop became the new living room. It replaced the diner. It replaced the pub. It was a place with comfortable chairs, jazz music, and the smell of roasted beans. You could bring a laptop. You could write a screenplay. You could meet a date. It was safe, it was warm, it was reliable. Starbucks exported this model to the world. From Seattle to Tokyo, from London to Dubai, the Green Mermaid became a global icon. It standardized the Italian experience, packaging it and selling it on every corner. While some criticize the homogenization, there's no denying that it raised the floor. It taught the world that coffee should be freshly ground. It taught the world that coffee could be a treat, a luxury, a daily indulgence. But as the second wave crested and washed over the globe, the connoisseurs began to get restless again. They looked at the dark, oily roasts of the second wave and felt that something was being lost. When you roast a bean very dark, you taste the roast, the carbon, the smoke, the caramelization. But you lose the intrinsic flavor of the bean itself. You lose the terroir. Terroir is a French word, usually used for wine. It means a sense of place. It means that a grape grown in the limestone soil of Burgundy tastes different from a grape grown in the volcanic soil of Sicily. The same is true for coffee. A coffee bean grown on a high-altitude slope in Ethiopia, in the shade of banana trees, tastes of blueberries and jasmine. A coffee bean grown in the red clay of Kenya tastes of black currant and tomato savory. A coffee bean grown in the mountains of Colombia tastes of chocolate and walnuts. The dark roast burned these delicate flavors away. It homogenized them under a blanket of smoke. So, the third wave was born. This movement was not about consistency, it was about transparency. It was about treating coffee not as a fuel, and not just as a milky treat, but as an artisanal foodstuff. It was a return to the seed. Let us enter a third wave cafe. The aesthetic is different. It is minimalist. There are no comfortable velvet armchairs. There are stark wooden stools and industrial lighting. The menu is simple. There are no syrups. There is no whipped cream. The coffee is roasted light. Sometimes so light it looks like peanut skins. The barista is not just an employee. They are a craftsman. They wear a denim apron. They have a scale. They weigh the ground coffee to the 1/10 of a gram. They weigh the water. They check the temperature with a digital thermometer. They pour the water from a gooseneck kettle in a slow, concentric circle, blooming the grounds. This is the ritual of the pour-over. It is slow. It takes 3 or 4 minutes to make a single cup. It is a meditation. The water hits the grounds and carbon dioxide is released, the bloom, bubbling up like breathing earth. The water extracts the soluble compounds gently. When you drink this coffee, it is a shock if you are used to the diner or the second wave. It is tea-like. It is bright. It is acidic. It has clarity. You can taste the fruit. You can taste the flower. You are tasting the specific weather of a specific hillside in a specific year. This movement brought a new focus on the farmer. In the commodity model, the farmer was invisible. In the third wave, the farmer is the star. The bag of coffee tells you the name of the farm, Finca El Injerto. It tells you the name of the farmer, Arturo Aguirre. It tells you the altitude, 600 meters. It tells you the processing method, washed. Processing. This is a crucial, boring, fascinating part of the story. How do you get the seed out of the fruit? There are 3 main ways, and each changes the flavor profile entirely. First, the washed process. This is the most common in Latin America. The fruit is picked. A machine strips the skin and pulp off. The beans, covered in sticky mucilage, are thrown into fermentation tanks filled with water. They sit there for 12 to 36 hours. Bacteria eat the mucilage. Then the beans are washed clean in channels of water and dried. This produces a clean, bright, acidic cup. It tastes of the seed and nothing else. Second, the natural or dry process. This is the ancient way used in Ethiopia and Brazil. The whole cherry is picked and laid out on raised beds in the sun. It dries like a raisin. The fruit shrivels around the seed. As it dries, the sugars and flavors of the fruit ferment and seep into the bean. After weeks, the dried fruit is hulled off. This produces a heavy, syrupy, fruity cup. It tastes like blueberry jam, strawberry, and wine. It is wild and funky. Third, the honey, or pulped natural process. This is a hybrid. You strip the skin, but you leave some of the sticky fruit on the bean while it dries. The mucilage turns golden and sticky like honey. It produces a cup that is sweet and rounded, halfway between the clean-washed and the wild natural. The third wave obsessives argue over these processes. They argue over the grinder, conical burrs versus flat burrs. They argue over the water chemistry, magnesium content versus calcium content. It is a rabbit hole of detail. But at its heart, it is an act of respect. It is an attempt to honor the incredible amount of labor that goes into every single bean. Think about the labor. A coffee tree produces cherries once a year. The cherries do not ripen all at once. A branch will have green, yellow, and red cherries on it at the same time. To get the best coffee, you cannot use a machine. You need a human hand. A picker must walk up the steep, muddy slope of a mountain. They must look at a branch and pick only the perfectly red cherries, leaving the green ones for next week. They fill a basket strapped to their waist. It is heavy. The sun is hot. The insects are biting. They do this all day. Then they carry the heavy sacks, 60 crows 70, down the mountain to the weighing station. Then the processing begins, the fermentation, the washing, the drying, the raking of the beans on the patios every hour so they don't rot, the sorting by hand to remove defects, the bagging, the shipping across the ocean, the roasting, the grinding, the brewing. All of that labor, all of those hands, all of those miles, just so you can stand in your kitchen for 5 minutes and have a cup of hot brown liquid. It is a miracle of logistics. It is a miracle of cooperation. And yet, despite all this complexity, the effect is simple. It is the pause. Let's talk about the culture of the cup in different parts of the world. In Scandinavia, they drink more coffee per capita than almost anyone else, but they drink it differently. They drink café. It is usually a light roast, filter coffee, drunk black, and in large quantities. It is a warm companion to the long, dark winters. They have a concept called fika in Sweden. Fika is not just a coffee break. It is a social institution. It is mandatory. You stop working. You sit down. You have a cup of coffee and a cinnamon bun, kanelbulle. You talk. You reset. To skip fika is to be antisocial. In Vietnam, the coffee culture is born of French colonialism, but adapted to the tropical heat. They use a fin filter, a small metal cup that sits over the glass. They use dark, intense Robusta beans, often roasted with butter or cocoa butter. The coffee drips slowly onto a layer of sweetened condensed milk at the bottom of the glass. Then they add ice. Café soda. It is sweet, strong, cold, and intense. It is a dessert and a rocket fuel in one. In Turkey and Greece, the culture is about divination. After you drink the thick, unfiltered coffee, You turn the cup upside down on the saucer. You wait for it to cool. Then you flip it over. The grounds have left patterns on the side of the cup. A fortune teller, or your grandmother, reads the shapes. A bird means news. A mountain means obstacles. A ring means marriage. The coffee is not just a drink, it is a window into the future. In Japan, there is the kisaten. These are old-school coffee shops preserved in time. They are dark, quiet, filled with smoke and jazz. The masters there practice the hand-drip method with a level of precision that borders on the religious. They might take 10 minutes to brew a single cup, drop by drop. The coffee is aged. Sometimes the beans are aged for years before roasting. It is a place of deep respect and silence. And then there is the future. What happens next? We are entering an era of uncertainty. Climate change is threatening the coffee lands. The Coffea arabica plant is fragile. It needs specific temperatures. As the world warms, the band of land suitable for growing coffee is moving up the mountain. Eventually, the mountain runs out. Scientists and farmers are racing to find solutions. They are looking back at the wild forests of Ethiopia for new genetic material. They are looking at a species called Coffea stenophila, a rare coffee from Sierra Leone that tastes like Arabica but grows in the heat like Robusta. It might be the coffee of the future. We are also seeing the rise of lab-grown coffee. Scientists are figuring out how to grow the coffee cells in a bioreactor, without the tree, without the farm. It sounds sci-fi, it sounds sterile. It lacks the romance of the mist-covered mountain. But it might be the way we ensure that future generations can still taste this flavor. But let us not worry about the future tonight. Tonight is about the past and the present. It is about the comfort of the known. I want you to imagine the sound of a spoon stirring sugar into a cup. Clink, clink, clink. It is a circular sound. It is a sound of preparation. I want you to imagine the color of the coffee as you pour milk into it. The way the white plumes swirl into the black, creating turbulent clouds of tan and beige, gradually resolving into a uniform, comforting toffee color. It is fluid dynamics in a mug. I want you to imagine the warmth of the ceramic against your palms on a cold day. That transfer of heat from the water that boiled, to the bean that roasted, to the cup that holds, to the hand that receives. It is a chain of energy. We have walked a long road. We started with Kaldi and his dancing goats. We sat with the Sufi mystics in Yemen. We smuggled seeds with Baba Budan. We crossed the Atlantic with Gabriel de Clio and his water ration. We built the empires of Brazil and Vietnam. We invented the espresso machine and the instant powder. We rebelled with the beatniks and the third-wave hipsters. We have seen how this simple seed has shaped our world. It has built economies. It has fueled revolutions. It has created spaces for conversation and spaces for solitude. It has woken us up for centuries. But now, the purpose of this story is the opposite. The purpose is not to wake you up. It is to let the sheer weight of this history, the density of these details, press you down into the mattress. The coffee shops are closed now. The baristas have wiped down the counters and turned off the machines. The lights are off. The beans are stored in their hoppers, waiting for the morning. The ships are crossing the dark oceans, silent under the stars. The trees in the mountains are breathing in the cool night air. The cycle continues. It always continues. The sun will rise and the water will boil again. the aroma will drift through the house again. But that is for tomorrow. That is for the next turn of the earth. For now, the story is told. The cup is drained. The silence has returned, claiming the space where the words were. Let the steam dissipate. Let the ground settle. Let the heavy, warm darkness take over. There is nothing left to brew. There is nothing left to drink. There is only rest. The silence has now become a physical weight in the room. It is a comfortable, heavy quilt that has been pulled up to your chin. The narrative is winding down, the engine is cooling, and the steam has all but vanished into the cool air of the night. We have traveled a great distance together, traversing continents and centuries, but we have finally arrived at the most important destination of all, the here and the now, the quiet end of the day. Before we place the final period on this story, before the screen goes dark and the dream takes over, I have one last quiet question for you to answer in the privacy of the comments section. We have spoken so much about the past, about history and trade and machines, but I want to know about your future, specifically tomorrow morning. When you wake up after this long rest, what is the very first thing you will do? Will you reach for water? Will you stretch? Or will you walk, sleep-eyed, to the kitchen to begin the ritual again? Tell me your morning routine. Write it down, and in doing so, give yourself permission to let go of it until the sun actually rises. Now, uncross your legs, let your jaw hang loose, let the tension drain out of your neck. Let us finish this. We have spoken of the bean, the machine, and the trade. But we have not yet spoken of the chemistry of the quiet. We must address the paradox. We have spent the last hour talking about the world's most popular stimulant in order to put you to sleep. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? But it is not, because coffee, in its essence, is not just about energy. It is about comfort. It is about warmth, and warmth is the sister of sleep. Let us drift into the microscopic world for a moment. I want you to visualize the human brain, not as a biological organ, but as a house with many rooms. Throughout the day, as you work, as you think, as you move, your brain produces a chemical called adenosine. Think of adenosine as a fine, soft dust. It accumulates slowly. It settles on the furniture of your mind. As the day goes on, this dust piles up heavier and heavier. This is the feeling of tiredness. This is the sleep pressure. When you drink coffee, the caffeine molecule enters this house. It looks remarkably similar to the adenosine dust. It floats into the receptors, the locks on the doors, and it blocks them. It stops the brain from realizing how dusty the room has become. It borrows energy from the future, but eventually the caffeine breaks down, the blockers dissolve, and the dust is still there, waiting. That is where we are now. The caffeine of the day has washed away, the dust has settled. The house is ready to be closed up for the night. But let us move away from the brain and back to the object itself. We have neglected the vessel. The cup, the mug, the chalice. The history of coffee is also the history of ceramics. I want you to imagine the clay, river mud, cool, gray, heavy earth. Thousands of years ago, hands shaped this mud into a vessel. They placed it in a kiln. They subjected it to fire, just like the coffee bean. The fire transformed the mud into stone. It vitrified it. It made it hard and waterproof. Think of the surface of your favorite mug, the glaze. It is smooth, like glass. It is cool to the touch when empty, but it becomes a radiator when full. The handle, that small loop of ceramic, is a technological marvel. It allows you to hold fire in your hand without being burned. It acts as a bridge between the heat of the liquid and the safety of the skin. There is a sound associated with the mug, the sound of it being placed on a wooden table. Thunk. A dull, resonant sound, the sound of a spoon stirring against the sides. Ching, ching, ching. A high-pitched, circular bell. The sound of the last sip, the change in pitch as the liquid drains away, and the acoustics of the cup change. These are the sounds of safety. They are the sounds of home. And what of the heat itself? Thermodynamics. The second law. Entropy. When you pour a hot cup of coffee, the universe immediately begins to steal that heat. The steam rises, carrying the energy away into the air. The ceramic absorbs the energy. The liquid cools. It is inevitable. There is a Japanese phrase, mono no aware, which speaks to the beauty of transience. The beauty of things because they do not last. A cup of coffee is the perfect example. It is perfect only for a few minutes. It is too hot, then it is perfect, then it is warm, and then it is cold. We drink it to capture that fleeting moment of perfection. But tonight, we do not need to capture anything. We can let the heat go, we can let the entropy win. Let us broaden our view one last time. I want you to think about the night watch. While you sleep, while you drift off listening to this, the world of coffee does not stop. In fact, it is the fuel of the guardians. Think of the truck drivers moving down the interstate highways at 3 a.m., their headlights cutting through the dark. In their cup holders there is coffee. It is keeping them awake so they can deliver the goods of the world. Think of the nurses and doctors in the emergency rooms, standing under the humming fluorescent lights. There is a pot of coffee in the break room, brewing a fresh batch. It is keeping them alert so they can watch over the sick. Think of the lighthouse keepers, if any still exist, or the air traffic controllers watching the radar screens. They are drinking coffee. Why am I telling you this? Because it means you do not have to stay awake. The world is being watched. The sentinels are at their posts, cups in hand. They have taken the watch. You are relieved of duty. You can let go of the responsibility of the day. The coffee is doing its work for them, so it doesn't have to do it for you. We must also acknowledge the zero wave. This is the coffee of silence. This is the decaf consumed at a diner after a movie. This is the cup you hold just to warm your hands. This is the coffee that has surrendered its power. There is a specific peace in drinking coffee that will not wake you up. It is a rebellion against the utility of the drink. You are drinking it for the flavor, for the ritual, for the comfort, but with none of the consequence. It is a ghost drink. It is a lullaby in a mug. And now we must look at the global sunset. The coffee belt, that strip of land between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, is wrapping around the earth. As the sun sets in Brazil, the workers are putting down their baskets. The drying patios are covered with tarps to protect the beans from the dew. The plantation goes dark, the crickets begin to sing in the rows of trees. As the darkness moves west, it hits Colombia, then Central America, then Hawaii. The world of coffee is going to sleep, time zone by time zone. The roasters in Seattle are turning off their gas flames. The cafés in Melbourne are stacking their chairs on the tables. The espresso machines in Rome are being back-flushed with detergent. The pressure released. The boilers cooling down. Everything is slowing down. The grinder's burrs have stopped spinning. The water has stopped boiling. The steam has dissipated. We have walked a very long road, you and I. We stood in the ancient forests of Ethiopia and watched the goats dance. We smelled the first beans burning in the monk's fire. We crossed the Red Sea to Yemen and chanted with the Sufis in the dark. We smuggled 7 seeds on the stomach of a pilgrim to India. We sat in the smoke-filled rooms of London's penny universities, listening to the news of ships and kings. We lounged in the marble halls of Vienna, watching the snow fall, stirring honey into our cups. We sailed across the Atlantic, sharing our water ration with a seedling to keep it alive. We watched the steam engines of Italy press water through pucks of iron-red earth. We stood at the counter of a diner in the rain, watching the waitress pour from a glass pot. We weighed our beans to the gram in the minimalist shops of the modern age. We have seen it all. The history is complete. The map is filled in. And now we are back in your room. The journey is over. The baggage has been unpacked. There's nothing left to learn tonight. There's nothing left to remember. The facts can drift away, leaving only the feeling of the journey, warm, dark, and grounding. I want you to visualize one final image. Imagine a cup of coffee sitting on a bedside table. It is dark in the room. The coffee is no longer hot, it is perfectly still. The surface is like a black mirror, reflecting the dim light of the moon outside the window. There is no steam rising. There is no movement. It is liquid stillness. Inside that cup is the history of the world, but it is at rest. The molecules are moving slower and slower. The energy is dormant. You are that cup. You are still. You are cooling down. You are at rest. The narrative is ending. The voice is fading. The silence is reclaiming the space. The machine is off. The bean is sleeping. The world is turning. Sleep well.